Hello, everybody. Today we're going to be covering section 9.5. Now, 9.5 is one of the biggest, most important topics in AP Environmental Science. It's going to kind of summarize a lot of the things that we have talked about. And so because there's so much essential knowledge, there's a lot to it, it's very important. It has been broken up into two parts. So we will be covering part 1, and then our next video will be part 2. So this is part 1 of global climate change. So the learning objective for today is that you can explain how changes in the climate, both short and long-term, impact ecosystems. Some of the essential knowledge that you're going to gain is the history of our global temperatures, how they've ebbed and flowed, what they look like now, some of the effects of climate, the effects on the climate from these temperatures, how marine ecosystems are impacted, and how it also impacts bigger things like our entire atmospheric circulation. So first, we're going to talk about historic climate change. Now, I know that we have covered this before in this class, but I'm going to recap some of it, bring in a few topics from different units. But a reminder that Earth's climate has varied over geologic time, largely due to the variations in Earth's orbit around the sun. So we have this first idea of how its eccentricity is going to vary. Now, this diagram here, it's a little bit overstated. The shift that we get in the eccentricity is actually not as extreme as this, but it's just kind of simulating it to show you more clearly what we're talking about with it. So because of this eccentricity, which is shifting, the difference we're talking like over 100,000 years is where we get this slow ebbing. It's not something that's waffling on a year-to-year basis. But what this does is it brings it closer to and further from the sun at different times. So the more eccentric that it is, it means that it's further from the sun. And so these times where we're closer, it's going to be warmer. The times that we are farther away, it is going to be colder. Another thing is going to be based on its obliquity, which is talking about how it tilts towards the sun. And this is going to be shifting around like every 40,000 years here. And what this is going to do is it's going to be exposing those northern latitudes to higher insolation at different times. And so if we're looking at this diagram here, we still are always going to have this tilt in Earth's surface, but it can just slightly vary to where these polar regions are going to be even more tilted towards the sun, which is going to get it more direct sunlight in certain times of the year. And so both of these, again, we're talking like tens to 100,000 years. It's not something that's just shifting tons, which is why when we look at these variations, we're going to be looking at variations over like 100,000 years. Sorry, the little parentheses is a typo there. Ignore that. But basically, it's going to lead to predictable variation in Earth's climate. And these are called the Milankovitch cycles. And this is going to be, again, cycles that are occurring like every 100,000 years, not like 5,000 years. So if we look at our historical climate, scientists have been able to measure and estimate Earth's historical temperatures using 3 main pieces of evidence. The first one is going to be looking at these little ocean organisms here, known as foraminifera, and they have these shells. And these shells are going to be in ocean sediment. So as we look at fossilized remains, different species have different temperature tolerances. So we can tell when we look at the soil what the temperatures were at these times. Like we know a certain soil is 1,000,000 years old. And so we can tell based on the temperature tolerances of these what temperatures we had at certain times in Earth's climate. So we can see the variation in, okay, at this time it was warmer, at this time it was going to be colder. We also are able to tell carbon dioxide levels by looking at air bubbles that are trapped in ice cores. And the ice cores are going to contain ancient atmospheric gas. So we can actually tell based on these bubbles how much carbon dioxide was in them. So we've got ways to tell temperature, ways to tell carbon dioxide. And our third thing we can do is look at what isotope concentrations there were in this ancient ice for oxygen. So if we have a oxygen 18 isotope, that occurs when there's warmer temperatures. So if we're seeing more of that isotope, we know the temperatures were warmer in that times. If we're seeing more of the oxygen 16 isotope, that means temperatures were lower. So we're able to use all three of those to kind of put together an idea of how we had carbon dioxide levels and how we had temperature levels historically. So as we look at this, again, we see that there's about a cycling of like every 100,000 years or so. And this has been going on we can track it like the past million years. And it's pretty typical. You're seeing this. Now, if we look over the past like 100 years, clearly our carbon dioxide levels are way higher than anything that we have seen historically. And we are also starting to see the warmth level up, but this is kind of where we're at with carbon dioxide levels compared to how it has been historically. So although we do have a cycling, we have never seen these levels of carbon dioxide in the normal tracking that we've been seeing of our Earth's climate. And again, as I said, this is like every 100,000 years that we tend to see ice ages with warmer periods. Now, one of the things that we have to be aware of as scientists is that carbon dioxide levels are very correlated with temperature, but we can't 100% understand the causality of the past 100. We can use all of our points of data. We can tell that when carbon dioxide up, temperature's up, but it's sort of that like chicken before the egg. Did carbon dioxide go up and then temperature? Did the temperature cause the carbon dioxide? Because it's a positive feedback loop. Like they're both involved with each. And so we can't always know the exact cause of like which happened where, but we do know that it is a cycling. And we're able to do our best interpretation based on all the gathering that we are able to do of our evidence. But just kind of keep that in mind, correlation versus causation, and putting together all the pieces of that image. So what are the effects of climate change? We know that there is a variation. We also know that in recent times, we are seeing a crazy level of carbon dioxide that is not tracking with historical. So when we have these rising temperatures, rising carbon dioxide, here's some of the things that happen. When we have rising temperatures, this leads to habitat loss and species loss, causes droughts, soil desiccation, heat waves, increased precipitation in some regions due to like the Hadley cells. And so this is going to be a lot of impacts that can happen when our temperatures rise. We are also going to get rising sea levels as our glacier polar ice melts and as we get thermal expansion of our water. You're going to have higher levels, which is going to lead to things like flooding. We also have melting of the permafrost. Remember that permafrost is that like frozen tundra soil in the tundra regions. As that begins to thaw, it is going to release trapped methane and carbon dioxide from anaerobic decomposition, which is going to add even more greenhouse gases to our climate, which is going to also cause the temperatures, more positive feedback loops. So as we're seeing right here, this is like an example of the melting permafrost, and all of this is decomposition that's going to be releasing these gases. And as I said, here's that positive feedback loop. As temperatures rise, more is going to thaw. As that happens, we're going to release more carbon dioxide and methane, which is going to cause temperatures to rise, which is going to cause this, it's going to continue. Now, what are some risks that we see with global temperature warming 2 degrees Celsius, which might not feel like that much, but here's going to be all of the different impacts. We're going to have our ecosystems that are going to be threatened, the extreme weather events, large-scale singular events like ice sheets collapsing, coral die-off, the Arctic region melting, coastal flooding, river flooding, crop yields. And so all of these are kind of showing you like what is the level of risk of this happening. And clearly as we get to 2, like all of these are at high to very high risks. Some of these even start happening with like not even just a half of a degree Celsius, we already get increased risks of all of these things happening, especially things like coral die-off. This has a much lower threshold. And so, I mean, some things like tourism might take a little while, but there are impacts on all of these things. And it's kind of a gradient. Some things like coral, they're going to be very sensitive. They're going to get a hit even earlier. Other ones might take a little bit longer, like heat-related mortality, but you can kind of see the level of risk as things are starting to warm. Now, what is our impact on coastal communities? Well, if we are going to get more rising of the oceans, and if you're on the coast, that's going to be a bummer. You're going to have property loss, damage. You might have to move. Like if you are now underwater, you can't keep having your house there. So you're going to have to go to a different location. So especially the lower income ones that can't build up buffers or can't relocate, that's going to be really impacting those that are coastal, especially our lower income communities that can't fight the change. They can't, like Venice, Italy is building up gates that like block the water. We're not going to have that option for a lot of lower income areas. And even those that are building flood barriers, it just kind of delays the inevitable. So even though Venice is sitting here like building these buffers, eventually it's going to keep going up, and eventually your buffers are not going to be able to stop your flooding, but they're definitely trying in the meantime. We're also going to get a loss of barrier islands. Now, barrier islands are important because they buffer coastal communities and ecosystems from wind and waves. Now, those are going to be gone as sea levels rise. So for example, if you look here, there's a barrier island that is going to be blocking this oyster reef. It's going to be blocking these houses. If the barrier island gets flooded, we no longer have that barrier anymore. And if you look at this diagram, it goes from what it looks like right here, where you have more of these barriers. And then as ocean levels rise, you're starting to see when the barriers are gone, some of these are already underwater, but we also start to get nothing that's blocking from really big waves, which is going to be a big problem. Now, as for atmospheric currents, this is another one that's going to be a big impact, and this is going to be throwing it back to Unit 4. So we'll do a little bit of a review to remind you of some of these. So if you remember our good old friends, the Hadley cells, this is what causes this circulation here, where you get at the equator, the warmer temperatures rise. As it cools, it's going to drop down with the cool, dry area, which kind of causes some of our more tropical areas versus our desert areas. And as we are having changes in the temperature, this is going to widen and weaken the Hadley cell. Now, as you are getting differences between the poles and the equator, the air is going to be coming down at different areas. So for example, here is our typical Hadley cell, where around our 30-degree north and south latitudes is where we're getting this. But the problem is, if your polar areas are starting to not be as cold, it's not going to be this cold air pushing up against the warm air and causing it to cool and condense. So what we're actually going to have happen is it will be warmer and warmer, and it won't keep dropping until you get closer and closer to these cold regions. So it's going to be expanding even more, which means it's gonna start sinking in different places. So it's gonna start shifting our subtropical zones, the more dry desert biomes that we typically see here around the 30-degree north and south latitudes. It's gonna push it towards the poles, and it's going to expand the tropics, which is going to now start having desert areas in places where they weren't already. So communities that are like farming, for example, think of like a California region. If you have some areas where you are farming, if you're losing all of your rain and you're starting to have droughts, you're not going to be able to farm. And so that's going to be causing issues with agriculture, but also just basic survival of the food that you are eating. And these regions are not going to be properly equipped for all of a sudden being like more desert regions. And so, yeah, between the 30 to 60, we're going to start experiencing more drier climates because the Hadley cells are going to be shifted. We are also going to get a weakened, destabilized jet stream. And so if you again remember back to Unit 4, as the Arctic warms well, as we normally have this cold in the Arctic and then this warmer around the equator. As the Arctic warms, it's going to cause a temperature difference between the equator and the poles. So up here is what we normally see happening. But as we are starting to have not so cold areas up here, you're having these warmer areas, it's going to push up. So, for example, as we get a little bit warmer in these areas, it's going to push up, and now the jet stream is going to be farther north. Now, the jet stream's all connected, and kind of think of it like a rope. If one of them is going up, you're going to have to go down to still make up for it. So then you're going to have like this weakened jet stream, and now it's going to be all curvy and not just the straight typical one. And yeah, then you're going to end up with some areas that are warm and other areas that are getting these like crazy polar vortex type storms. Now, because you have this temperature and pressure differential, it's going to be a weak, wobbly jet stream that is not going to be as predictable as it has been. And this is kind of another one. If we zoom in here to like the United States, what this does is it's going to lead to extremely cold spells in eastern United States and more dry spells in the western United States. So as this vortex kind of ends up topsy-turvy there, then we are going to get that occurring. Now, we've had a few events in like the past decade where we start getting crazy cold storms that are happening on the East Coast, even into Texas. And this is because of the fact that the polar vortex is being wonky and is getting pushed down and bringing these cold storms to areas where we have not typically seen this level of like polar vortex level storms, which obviously is going to be a problem for communities that are not prepared for that, or even just storms like that are going to be difficult for communities to deal with when it is not something that they've typically been seeing. And so these crazy storms are because of a weakened polar vortex due to changes in our temperatures between the equator and the poles. So here's going to be your practice FRQ for 9.5. I want you to look at this diagram here and use this data to explain how the data above supports the hypothesis that a destabilized polar jet stream caused the cold spell seen in the Midwest. That's going to be your practice FRQ for 9.5. Those are your notes on 9.5 about global climate change.